everyone, and thank you for joining us today on our webinar, EB-5 After the RIA. This is a section out of CanAm's recent white paper, but a very important section that focuses on what the EB-5 program has done since the RIA based on numbers, as well as what we're looking for in terms of what the EB-5 program can be beyond where we are now, and how important it will be our advocacy efforts to kind of make sure that the continued benefits that EB-5 has really brought about, which we'll see in the numbers we see today, to the United States, to the economy, at a time when it needs it most. Joining me here today are two very esteemed gentlemen from IIUSA, Aaron Grau, Executive Director of IIUSA. For the people watching today, Aaron, could you share a little bit more about yourself?
About myself? Well, I joined IIUSA in 2018, well before the last reauthorization and the creation of the RIA. It's been a pleasure to get to know everybody and to drink from the fire hose of EB-5, learn its ins and outs, and I look forward to bringing it all to bear for reauthorization in 2027 and hopefully a permanent program.
Aaron, you're very humble and modest. Having seen us through the deauthorization of the program and the program lapse and the reauthorization, it's been, I think, it was a really big, heavy lift over the past several years that you've been with IIUSA. So we all appreciate your leadership getting so many regional centers together, as well as everyone on the Hill, to see the continued value of EB-5 to the U.S. economy.
You're very kind.
Absolutely appreciate. Lee, who is the Director of Policy Research and Data Analytics at IIUSA, is very much the data brain trust of, I think, the entire industry. But Lee, if you could share with everyone a little bit about what you do at IIUSA and what you continue to do for the industry at large.
Sure, happy to. First of all, thank you for the opportunity, Christine and the CanAm team, to be here. I will never turn down an opportunity to be a webinar with the great Aaron Grau and Christine Chen, so glad to be here. About myself, first of all, I would like to get things straight. I'm not a high school or college kid, although a lot of people think I look very young. Thank you for the compliment. But actually, I joined IIUSA 10 years ago. So I joined the association in 2015, and then have seen the up and down in EB-5 in the past decade. So my role in IIUSA is just to crunch numbers and make sense of all the different raw data that we connect from USCIS, State Department, DHS, Department of Commerce even, and try to make sense of what the data is telling us in terms of the trend of EB-5. And this is my focus, and I believe this will continue to be our focus for my next chapter in IIUSA. Glad to be here.
We appreciate everything you've done. I think what's been really important over the past several years at EB-5 is you being able to share the information and the analysis with everyone in the industry, that there is a lot more transparency and a lot less misunderstandings of what's going on. I think for all of us to move forward, this has been a really important dialogue, bringing it out to not just people here in the U.S., but abroad. So I very much thank you for your contributions and kind of keeping this very important discussion going, which will continue today on our webinar. So thank you both. Aaron, if I could start, we've shared that both of you are from IIUSA. CanAm has long been members of IIUSA, but if you could share with everyone here a little bit about the organization and its mandate and what role it plays within the industry, I think that would be a great way to start.
Sure, of course. Thank you. IIUSA, Invest in the USA, is the only not-for-profit trade association that is focused on the EB-5 industry. And by that, I mean regional centers, as well as all of the other organizations, lawyers, banks, developers, migration agents around the world who are stakeholders in the EB-5 program. Our role for that audience, as well as for the media and for policymakers, is threefold. First of all, we are a convener. We are the platform that anybody can come to and contribute to the EB-5 dialogue. Two, we are an educator. We spend a lot of time working with people who are new to the industry, and especially congressional staff and administrative staff, so that they understand what EB-5 is and what it brings to the U.S. economy. And finally, we are an advocate. We spend a lot of time on Capitol Hill and with the administration, singing from the mountaintop, if you will, about all the good things that the EB-5 program brings to the country insofar as job creation, economic development, and of course, the immigrants themselves who come to make a new life in the United States. So we convene, we educate, and we advocate, and our audience can be as broad as all of Congress, as well as the EB-5 community itself.
I think that one of the more difficult challenges and tasks that you as an organization take on is really to try to find commonality between all the different interest groups in EB-5, some of them which are very competing. A lot of applause to you all for taking on what can sometimes be a very difficult task for a very important program that a lot of people don't know about. So, you guys have, I think, recently celebrated 20 years as a trade organization. So I think it really looks at how long and how much good you all have been doing for the EB-5 program. I think everyone agrees that the passage of the RIA in 2022 was a huge milestone for EB-5. Up until then, very little legislation had been passed other than its enactment back in 1990. So it was a big milestone. Also came after a hard time after the program was lapsed for almost a year. But now that it feels like the past 3 years have flown by, we've all been very busy. And I think everyone has kind of gotten more used to what the RIA and what it offers. But there's certain things I think on everyone's mind right now. One of the key items that came about in the passage of the RIA is grandfathering. The concept of grandfathering was something that's long discussed, but had never really been part of the legislation. So with the passage of the RIA, the concept of once you file, you will be grandfathered into the program was introduced. Curiously, the grandfathering closes September 30th, 2026, while the program's current sunset is September 30th, 2027. And this has kind of really been seen as there's some in camps that believe there's going to be a huge rush to 2026 and a lame duck year between 26 and 27. There's others that are hopeful that there may be a possibility of revising the grandfather deadline. Aaron, since I know this is a hot topic of discussion probably you're having all the time, you guys have all been thinking strategically about how to bring this up, how this might be. We would love to hear from you whether or not you think it's possible for that to happen, whether the grandfathering deadline, how did the deadline come about, if you have any idea, a year prior to the sunset date?
Well, I do think it's possible to successfully address the sunset date and to reconcile the September 30, 26 date with the September 30, 27 date. I can speak on that in a moment. As far as where the aberrant date came from, I don't really know. Honestly, if I had to bet, I would say that it was an error. The trenches of developing the RIA were filled and everybody was exhausted, and we were running out of time to actually get the measure passed and signed into law when several folks pointed out the discrepancy. And if my memory serves, the reaction that we got from beleaguered congressional staff was, we're not going to open this bill up again. It's now or never. Do you want this or don't you want it? And we were sort of faced with an interesting choice. And so the decision was to go ahead and get the program reauthorized, along with all the integrity measures and the focus on rural. That's if my memory is correct. I don't think that it was a policy decision. I don't think that there was a congressional intent to create that lame duck provision, that lame duck program that you mentioned, which is why I think there is a real good possibility that we can have this fixed and that we can bring the 2026 date in line with 2027 at the very least. It would not be a technical fix. I've been admonished by our lobbyists saying it's not a technical fix. A technical fix is a grammatical error or a misspelling or something along those lines. This would actually be a substantive fix, changing the date of a particular provision but it's a very small fix. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
it's changing a 6 to a 7 that would allow us to then focus exclusively on September 30, 27 for the reauthorization. And we have had productive conversations with a couple of congressional offices who understand what's going on and who have committed to championing the issue. If we are successful, my guess, and this is for whatever that's worth, is that the change would take place in the fiscal year 2027 appropriations measures,
Okay.
which would be hashed out and debated in the summer and fall of 2026. So we'd be cutting it close. It's possible that a fixed 2026 provision doesn't actually become law until afterwards, and maybe there's a look back provision there. But who's to say? All I can tell you is that when we've explained the issue to policymakers, they sort of roll their eyes, they get it, and they understand why it needs to be fixed. And so I'm positive about the potential.
Well, it's really encouraging, honestly, that they don't see a purpose or any intent behind that difference. I think it's really important. I think that there's always a reluctance to get in the way of other people's plans. So if that's the case, what can stakeholders be doing to help in any way, other than holding their breath until September 30th, October 1st, 2026?
Well, I mean, I know this will sound a bit self-serving, but if you haven't already, join IIUSA. Your commitment to the association is a commitment to the industry and to the industry voice. And we need all the help we can get with regards to developing the political capital it takes to move even a small change like this. We're also going to be redeveloping a grassroots initiative. So if you are a member of the association, we'll be able to lean on you and understand who do you know in your community, who do you know at your city council or in the mayor's office that might be able to weigh in on our behalf. So that process has already begun, and we're looking forward to augmenting it through Q1 and Q2 next year.
Well, it's great to hear kind of what I will call cautious optimism that we can sync up the grandfathering and the sunset dates. I think that will be a huge surge to the continued progress on EB-5 and its potential impacts on our economy. So definitely encourage everyone who's watching to reach out to anyone to try to further this cause. Now that we've kind of discussed, I think, what has been on a lot of people on everyone's minds, I want to dig a little bit into the numbers since the passage of the RIA. I think we've all been struggling with a lack of data from USCIS. While historically USCIS has actually published processing times and numbers of approvals for EB-5 project and investor petitions in the past, this has not been the case with any post-RIA filings since the new forms were introduced. Additionally, I think as another wrinkle, while Department of State did regularly update its visa bulletin regarding the usage of EB-5 visas, even that really no longer tells us the whole story, because so many visas are actually being issued by USCIS and managed by them because of concurrent filers, which I think we all know anecdotally, and I think Lee, you've shared with us kind of based on some data, is making up possibly half or more of what's being filed these days. Lee, you and a few others in this industry are really leading the charge and providing a really data-based sense of what's been going on with EB-5 since the passage of the RIA. Can you share a little bit about what data sources you monitor and keep track of and that you've been relying on to come up with some of your analyses so people can understand where you're drawing information from?
Of course. So I guess the biggest data source is definitely from USCIS, because they have the most official data and they manage the program. So they keep track all the filing numbers, approval numbers, processing time numbers. I believe they do have a data set on all these data points. I'm optimistic about this. However, the problem is they do not share this data with the industry. So even though they publish data on a quarterly basis, sometimes it's like a little bit delayed. But until the last quarter, they did not publish any data on on the country of birth for the investors. So they only tell us like how many 526 or 526E has been filed, approved, denial, how many are pending. But we do not know who these investors are, and we don't know how long it takes for them to receive their approvals. So there are a lot of unknown here. Until last quarter, thank God, maybe they are annoyed by our freedom of information request, so they voluntarily published the data on the country of birth for the 526 and 526E filings. So we have more data to crunch on, and also I have more gray here thanks to them. But definitely, USCIS is the biggest data source that I rely on my data analysis. And you mentioned Department of State as well, but also State Department has been lagging behind for their data publication. In the good old days, they usually publish the monthly quarter issues every month, but they did not publish anything since July. So in the past 4 months, we do not have any updated data from the State Department. They don't have published the annual data with the visa statistics for this year or last year too. So there's a lot of data that we need to run the analysis to tell our stakeholders what's going on in EB-5. But unfortunately, we do not have a lot of data from the official source, which is USCIS or State Department. And thankfully, IIUSA, we represent the EB-5 industry. We have a lot of members. We have a lot of regional center members, and also lawyers as our members. They all have a lot of projects, and they all have a lot of investors. So we have been working with our members to try to connect the data to fill in the gap for the information. And I have to shout out with for CanAm, Christine, you know how annoying I am. I always reach out to you and ask if you can share the data with us. And thanks to a few leaders in this industry, IIUSA has been able to connect a lot of data from our regional center members. And right now, our database represents over the majority of the total filings. So we can crunch this data that are shared with us by our members to see some trends on processing time and also like EB-5 visa issues from the AOS side too.
You know what? From our perspective, we have very shared mutual interest in the importance of having this data available, not just to us, but everybody in EB-5 right now. Again, I think with the RIA, there was kind of a second life to EB-5, and the cooperation among competitors, among service providers, I think is been a refreshing aspect since the passage of the RIA, and let's lean on that. Let's leverage that to get more information, get more understanding, get more analysis. So now that you've shared how difficult your task has been, can you walk us through a little bit of the analysis that you've been doing and to kind of understand and what you've been able to share with the EB-5 program since the passage of the RIA?
Of course, happy to. I am very limited with my verbal explanation, so I will rely on my PowerPoints. Let me just share my screen. There we go. So as Christine mentioned, there are huge change after the RIA, and the data actually reflects this change by the growth of the program. So this is the number of 526 and 526E petitions that have been filed by fiscal year. So we all see in 2015, we reached the all-time high in terms of case filing. We don't know exactly why, but I would take the credit as because I joined IIUSA in 2015, so we reached the all-time high. However, I have bad juju, so the number of filings keep declining since 2015. I do not think it's because of me. It was because of backlog and retrogression, and also the long processing time. This caused a lot of issues for the EB-5 program. So we see the gradual decline in terms of case filings from 2015 and reach all-time low in 2021. And then we have the lapse of the program. And thank God we have the RIA that was passed in 2022. And since then, if you can see the right-hand side of the chart, the number of case filing has been increasing year after year. Especially in fiscal year 2025, we only have the data for the first 3 quarters. Right. But the number of case filed has been higher than the entire year of 2024. So we're expecting record high case filings in the current fiscal year. And Christine already mentioned how busy you guys are since the RIA. So it's a good news.
Absolutely. I think, despite a lot of the transparency and integrity measures that have been imposed on regional centers, the fact is stakeholders have been able to rise to the occasion, abide by those rules, and I think get more trust from investors that they're going to be better protected in a post-RIA program. So I think this is great to see.
Yeah, I would say that the RA, have a lot of new provisions that definitely not only boost the confidence in the investors, but also offer a lot of new benefits, like the reserve visa or the priority processing. That solve a lot of concerns about visa backlog and opens a lot of opportunities. If I may continue on the next slide.
Absolutely.
So as I mentioned, the RA created reserve visa for rural and also high unemployment areas, and also infrastructure categories, and also priority processing for rural categories. So this is the number of case files by the investment type. The red one represents investors file their petitions associated with a high unemployment project, or we usually say is urban TEA project. And the green one is filings associated with rural projects. So we all know in the past of EB-5, urban TEA projects have dominant the case filings. Most majority of the investors, they invest in the urban area that qualify as a TEA. But in the third quarter of fiscal year 2024, we start to see this trend being shifted because we are seeing more cases are filed under the rural category. Started in late 2024, and looks like the gap has been increasing. More and more cases are filing for rural right now. And overall, we still see 51% of the cases are filed under the HUA or urban category versus 49% rural. But I think this percentage will be changing as we have new data coming in because of the strong growth in rural area.
I think certainly this is something the industry largely has been waiting to see, because anecdotally, this is what we've been hearing. This is what we've been seeing in terms of projects filed, waiting for kind of the numbers from USCIS to catch up. I agree with you that based on what we know, I would expect to see that the rural number continues to grow and eventually outpace high unemployment area filings over time.
Yeah, and also I think that this is exactly shows that the RA is working in terms of driving investment to rural areas. Before the RA, we didn't see much of the investment or much of the interest in rural area for EB-5. But right now, it's the majority of the filings. That means the majority of the EB-5 investments right now are going to rural area, which I think is exactly the congressional intent of the RA. So the RA is working.
Absolutely.
So the next one I would like to share is again by country of birth. So surprise, China is still the largest market after RA. So China accounts for approximately 51% of all the case filed after the RA. And this number shows you how many of these investors file associated with HUA or rural. So India is still the second largest investor market after RA. And then we are seeing a big growth in the rest of the world markets, including Taiwan and South Korea and Vietnam. And overall, based on the latest data shared by USCIS, we estimate over 13,000 investors have invested in the EB-5 program. After the RA, that is approximately over $10 billion in EB-5 investment. And 96% of these investors, they choose to invest through a regional center in a TEA project. So this shows a lot of investors have the confidence in EB-5 program after the RA, and vast majority of them choose a regional center to partner with.
And certainly you can see here with the number of rural filings for China and India, those are the countries that have most benefited from the set-aside category of the rural set-aside visas, as well as the priority processing that is important to some. And we see that those numbers kind of flip-flopped for other countries who have not historically suffered retrogression. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the future as we continue to get data and see those numbers evolve.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, we just talk about overall, the urban filing still higher than the rural filings overall. But if you look at China and India, now we have most cases filed under rural, especially for China, 3,500 rural cases versus only 2,800 for high unemployment. So those two top markets, because the investors, they knew how bad visual regression would be, and they just not choose to invest in rural, and so that they have more reserve visas, also like enjoy a faster approval time too.
No, absolutely. You had mentioned the recent data set from USCIS. What else have you? I think we finally saw some more adjudication numbers for individual investor petitions as well, right?
Well, as I can tell, you're always a step ahead. Let's talk about the approval numbers. So this is the latest number that we get from USCIS. I think the biggest update is that the agencies suddenly approved so many cases in Q3 2025. Before this quarter, usually we saw like 400 case approvals every quarter. But this quarter alone, they approved over 1,000 cases. So which is a big spike, as you can see from the chart. And if you can see the data points too, 2023, the first year after the RIA was passed, they only approved 63 526 and 560 cases. 2024, over 1,000. In 2025, again, the first 3 quarters alone, they already approved more than 1,800 cases. So we expect the case number approval will be spiked in this year. And congratulations to a lot of investors who received the approvals this year.
Absolutely. I think that for many of us who saw the numbers coming out of USCIS initially, we're wondering, there was a lot of worrying and hand-wringing about visas, carryover visas being wasted, and how adjudication times would probably increase a lot, given how many petitions were in queue, but how few had been approved. I think that it's with a bit of a sigh of relief that we're finally seeing the pace of adjudications finally be closer to where they need to be for this program to run smoothly. So.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And we know we have so many investors have already filed their petitions, but we did not see a lot of visa number being used. That means most of the visas could be lost from the reserve category if they are not used in the next year, even though they're carried over for 1 year. So with the previous adjudication pace, I expect that there will be a lot of visas under the reserve category being raised in 2025. Thank God they approved a lot of cases, and hopefully a lot of these new approvals can translate into visa usage in the second half of fiscal year 2025. So not that many reserve visas will be lost from the reserve category. So I think this is important because we already have so much demand for EB-5, and it's important that we do not raise any reserve visas to digest this existing demand.
Absolutely agree. We're for an industry that's always short on visas, wasting any is such a tragic loss for us.
Mm-hmm.
Given the usage of visas so far, it still doesn't feel like we're very close to exhausting the total number of visas available, especially in the set-aside categories. But I think that many are already thinking about kind of an invisible backlog, given the number of petitions filed but not approved. Can you explain why you and others who have been crunching a lot of this data have already started looking at final action dates being issued sometime in the next year, possibly especially for China and India? How you are going about estimating when that might happen?
That's a great question. I'm still working on it. The good news is now we have more data from USCIS. Now we know how many petitions are filed under rural, under high unemployment by which country. And another good news is now we see higher approval numbers coming out from USCIS. Because based on the prior approval numbers, now if they only approve 400 cases in a quarter, there's no way they can use all the visas available for the reserve category. So no need to worry about final action day. However, if these trends continue, if they prove more than 1,000 cases in a quarter, so maybe we will see a cutoff date in the second half of fiscal year 2026. But saying the second half is because, so even though the investors, after they receive the approval, they still have to not transfer their case to MEC or other department for the 485 adjudication. So it takes time between the case approval and visa issues. So there's always a delay. So my guesstimate is about 6 months delay. So that's why I don't think there will be any cutoff day. I don't think in the first half of 2026. In fact, looking at the visa bulletin right now, we already saw the December visa bulletin, and there's no cutoff day. There was no note or no warning sign about upcoming cutoff day. So I think like January or even February will still be current for reserve category. However, when we enter the second half of fiscal year 2026, it's hard to say. Again, largely depends on how many cases are approved by USCIS in a quarter. We only saw one quarter with high approval numbers. We do not know whether this will sustain. So to your question, I don't know.
I do think it's kind of an interesting time right now in where we are post RIA. You know, a lot of regional centers, a lot of immigration attorneys, a lot of investors have kind of tried a few things and figured out what works with USCIS in the post RIA environment. I think approval rates, as you said, have been relatively high, especially compared to pre-RIA adjudications. I think that a lot of the patterns of behavior that we now know to avoid has meant that most petitioners have a much more clear path towards approval. And the fact that projects have to be approved before petitions, individual investor petitions get approved, also means that there's that stage of certainty at that level. So I agree with you. We'll see whether or not USCIS can kind of continue this pace of adjudication. I think the next quarter, if and when the next quarter's data gets released, it'll be very telling to see whether or not this is an anomaly or whether or not USCIS is on track to kind of have a different pace of adjudication.
Yeah, absolutely. And since you mentioned the approval rate, I would like to share the data about approval rate too, because it's very encouraging. So we look at the 526E cases post RIA, the approval rate is very high. Even though, in the past, I was a little bit skeptical because they only approved so few cases. So maybe those lucky investors, the reason they got fast approval is because they have very, very strong regional center or very strong source of fund. But for 2025, we have a big spike in approval. Like we have larger data sample and the approval rate is still over 90%, which I think is very high. So that's definitely good news. But I would also like to point out this is not just post-RA trend, because if you look at the direct EB-5 investors, like the 526 or like standalone investors, the approval rate is not merely over 25%. So it's a big difference between the 526E and 526 standalone investors approval rate. So I totally agree with you on the sense that now the app have to be approved, like the project have to be approved or have to be filed before the investors can file their 526Es. That definitely boosts up the approval rate and boosts up the quality of the projects, and also send out a lot of certainty to investors too.
Absolutely. I think, as we have said all along, these provisions in the RI, although onerous, initially have really benefited the program overall. Aaron, we've been here before. We've been in a place where EB-5 is so successful that there is now potentially a wait for investors from certain countries to be able to get a green card. As we all saw from Lee's first, slide, we saw the dip in filings after 2017 when retrogression times really got substantially longer. And while redeployment and those kinds of things are no longer on the table, which is a bit of a relief to investors to know at least they can get their capital back on time, wait times for visas, especially in the set-aside categories, which represent a small percentage of the total number, because we are still trying to go through the pre-RA backlog as well. There's been previous attempts to try to get visa relief for EB-5. It is one of the categories with one of the smallest numbers of annual visa allocations, given how successful the program is, especially. I think that there's been in terms of pathways to get visa relief for EB-5, I think legislative relief seems kind of hard to get. There hasn't been much substantial legislation in EB-5 other than the RIA, and I think it is materially different than, say, a clarification regarding the date of the grandfathering sunset. What about derivative relief? I know Ira Kurtzman tried this a while back. The court threw it back to USCIS. USS is an enforcement agency. It's not really interested in establishing policy. Are there any other ways to get derivative relief? I think we all know that historically, a family of three, one of those was the applicant, the second and third visas were going to family members. Is there any possibility that they don't get counted so that we can reduce wait times and honestly keep the benefits of the program going on longer?
The answer to your question is yes. There is a path, multiple paths to getting visa relief. All of them are beset with politics, unfortunately. One of the more interesting ways forward might be to simply amend the Foreign Affairs Manual at the Department of State, the FAM. We've worked with counsel to develop or get a better understanding of exactly what provisions within the FAM would need to be altered, what the process is for going about getting those provisions altered to stop counting derivatives for the EB-5 category. So it's possible. The problem is that Secretary Rubio, the Secretary of State, takes direction from the White House. He's also influenced by certain committees on Capitol Hill. And so the extent to which he would be willing to make an amendment to the FAM, which by all accounts is actually the easiest way forward, is up in the air. We just don't know. Another path forward would be to see an executive order come through. It's possible that the president can sign an executive order eliminating the counting of derivatives, or alternatively directing the Department of State to amend the Foreign Affairs Manual to eliminate the counting of derivatives. That, however, is a bit of a steeper climb in actuality. Getting an executive order to the top of the stack of executive orders at the White House is not always easy. And again, it's beset with politics. And a lot of those politics emanate from Capitol Hill, where we've been told on the one hand, primarily from Republican offices, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Obviously, we would like to eliminate the derivative count so we can increase the number of investors, increase economic development and job growth. The Republicans, however, are most typically, maybe even these days stereotypically, anti-immigration. I don't think that's actually the case. I think the Republican Party, especially recently, we've seen a lot of very conservative pundits come out with op-eds that are very supportive of EB-5. So people like Stephen Moore and Mercedes Schlapp and others have come out and said, this is actually an America First program. It should be expanded, which has tamped down some of the traditional Republican opposition to expanding the visa count. Interestingly, the greatest pushback we get are from Democrats, who are very reluctant to give visa relief to the EB-5 category, while they're still struggling with visa relief for all of the other categories and the dreamers that they've always wanted to address and the backlog there. So there are paths forward. Interestingly, the gold card conversation has raised awareness of investment migration, and so people are very aware of the benefits that it brings to the table, which helps the conversation around those paths forward. It's just a tricky water to navigate when you start bringing in the political realities of whether it's xenophobia on the far right or it's we're not going to give visas to the rich people on the far left before we deal with the dreamers. Mm-hmm. Somewhere in between all of that is a solution. I think the reauthorization gives us a fantastic platform to have that conversation and to drive the point home. We're just going to have to wait and see and not let our foot off the gas pedal.
Absolutely. I think that we are at an interesting time. EB-5 has always traditionally received bipartisan support
Hmm.
for all the reasons you mentioned. It's an economic development pool. It's also an immigration program for not for just wealthy foreign nationals, but very successful, largely entrepreneurial individuals
Great.
who then bring that success and those talents to the United States and continue them. But to your point, getting all those nuances out to the community so they understand all that is a challenging narrative to communicate. So we definitely appreciate and laud your efforts to continue all that. And I think, many of us who've been in EB-5 for a long time have definitely joined in those efforts, and they continue to be really important as we move forward. So
We're grateful.
Lee, I just want to go back to something you mentioned earlier. You have been collecting data from a lot of IIUSA's members regarding petition filings. One thing that's still missing from the USCIS data set is adjudication times. And while a lot of investors in EB-5 have been flocking to rural because of the priority processing, part of it is just understanding what priority processing means in terms of actual times, because priority can mean a lot of different things to different people. And what that also means for high unemployment investors, because the overall theme from the RIA was to never go back to adjudication times of 4 years that we saw for pre-RIA investors. Can you share a little bit of your analysis from the data that you've collected regarding adjudication times, which I know you're constantly refining, but I think it's really important for people to kind of see how those trends are changing, if they have at all.
Of course. Again, I will need my PowerPoint to help me. So let me just share my screen real quick. Yeah. So as you mentioned, Christine, the priority processing is a new concept that was introduced by the RIA, but we have no idea what that means. USCIS did not offer any data to show us what that means. So thank God we have members. We have members' data to for the first time quantify what priority processing means. So this is what we are looking at right now. So right now we have over 5,500 cases, 526E cases in our data sample that accounts for over 55% of the overall filing. So our data sample, I think, is not perfect, but is representative enough for us to have some statistically significant conclusions. And these are the conclusions that we're looking at right now. For rural cases, on average, the processing time is 8 months. For urban TEA, average is 11 months. But this could be a little bit tricky because if you just look at the numbers, the difference is only 3 months, right? But this is when you need a data scientist like me to help you to kind of like dig into these numbers because you should look into how big each data sample are. So for rural, we have the approval about 1,200 cases. However, for urban TEAs, this 11 month is only stemmed from the 220 cases that receive approved. So that means the approval in urban TEA is much, much, much smaller data sample. And those lucky 220 investors, they receive their approval in 11 months versus there are a lot of investors who invest in urban TEA that's still pending. In fact, right now we're looking at 40% of all the cases filed under rural has been approved versus 9% of all the cases filed under HUA, they are approved. That means over 91% of those cases are still pending. And by looking into those pending cases, a lot of those cases has been pending for more than like a year. That means as soon as they receive the approval from USCIS, that their processing time will be counted into this data sample, and this 11 month will definitely go up. So I would say priority processing right now is definitely showing the in reality because we are seeing rural cases get approved not only faster, but also more and more rural cases are getting approved, relatively speaking, to the urban TA cases.
The number of rural filings that you're seeing in the information that you've gathered from IUSA's members as well as the USCIS data set, I mean, I have to believe it really reflects an immense increase in rural investment. I know you mentioned it's much greater, but do you have numbers that you can share with us regarding the increase in rural investment since the passage of the RIA?
Yes, we do. This is something that I want to talk about, our data collection initiative as well, if that's okay.
That'd be great.
Yeah, because for the data we collected, not only help us to understand the trends, but also help us on the advocacy front by a lot. Because USCIS did not publish how much investment has been generated by state, so we get these numbers from our members, have them share with us the projects they have done after the RA, so we can capture the investment trend and also the economic impact into different areas after the RA. And this is something that we are seeing right now. It's very important because we do not have these numbers at all from USCIS. It's
Right.
our members who share their data with us so that we can run this analysis. So I encourage more people to learn from Christine and share your numbers with IUSA. But this is what we are looking at right now. After the RA, we are seeing in terms of the number of rural projects, the increase is outstanding. It's over like 6-7 times increase in terms of the number of projects in rural areas right now. In terms of the investment amount,
Oh my
before the
gosh.
RA, our data sample suggests that 354 million has been invested in rural projects before the RA throughout the 15 or 20 years of EB-5 history. But in the just 3 years after the RA, this number has increased more than 15 times. Now we have more than $5 billion in terms of EB-5 investments in projects located in rural areas. There's a lot of increase. Total spending. So as Christine can tell you all, a lot of EB-5 capital, they are only served as part of the capital stack in projects. Because of EB-5, a lot of other capital will be able to be leveraged. So the actual spending of this project is definitely more than EB-5 investment, but with all the other capital combined, after the RA, we estimate over $13.6 billion in terms of private capital has been invested in those rural EB-5 projects. Last part is job creation. Most important part of the EB-5 program is creating jobs. So after the RA, we estimate over 133,000 jobs has been created thanks to the investment in this rural area, which is an outstanding increase from pre-RA. So in the just 3 years after the RA was passed, we already see this big change in rural areas. So think about what other possibilities can be created if we can remove derivative, if we can have more certainty on processing time. So I think the sky is really the limit.
I think this is, I think these numbers are just tremendous. One of the longtime criticisms of EB-5 has been that it wasn't going into other areas. It was going to the same places like New York City over and over again. But here you can see where the establishment of the rural set-aside category has created and motivated so much investment into rural areas. I know that IUSA, and you were very much part of it, commissioned a economic impact analysis of EB-5 prior to 2019. But I would imagine that in rural areas where the populations are lower, wages often are depressed, this kind of investment is probably going to have even greater impacts than you might see what has historically been the case for EB-5, which were very impressive to begin with. I think the overall blended impacts pre-RIA were very impressive, but I would imagine that in smaller rural economies that don't see as much downstream activity as you might see in a big urban city, that the economic impacts are going to be even greater. So I do hope that, as part of our efforts to reauthorize the program down the road, that we do see more analysis like this. I think it's incredibly important to show Congress that the intents of the RIA are successful. They've been met. I mean, they're just tremendously successful. So I will echo Lee's request for anyone who's watching, for anybody who has a regional center or anyone who's invested in a regional center project, to have them contribute this information. It'll be incredibly important as we continue, as everyone in the industry continues to have meetings on the Hill and convince them that this program is doing exactly what it was set out to do. So absolutely. And Lee makes it as easy as possible. Data is completely anonymous. It is purely for the purpose of providing these kinds of data for the industry at large, but especially for our advocacy efforts. Lee, the other another change that happened with the RIA was the TA definition changed slightly, which I think impacted high unemployment area designations as well. Namely the census tract where the project's located, it was only the directly adjacent census tracts around it that became. So they're really trying to avoid these very irregularly long-shaped TEAs that stretched across large regions. But I would imagine that also shifted where, as you call these urban EB-5 investments were taking place.
Oh, absolutely. So the RA changed the definition of high unemployment areas and by eliminating gerrymandering. So it's really just a donut hole right now, what we call. It's no more combining and adding real shape of census check to qualify as a urban TEA. And that actually changed a lot of the EB-5 projects in terms of rural areas. Because this is the number, again, that we developed from our database. Before the RIA, we can see the mega cities like New York. They account for 27% of all the investments that was invested in the EB-5 program before the RIA. And also big cities like Brooklyn, Seattle, Los Angeles. So these mega cities have driven attracted a lot of investments, not because they really enjoy a high unemployment rate, but because they can combine a lot of census tracts. Maybe we have some questions from the audience. Combine census checks, so to qualify as a TEA. But with the new definition after the RA, we can see a lot of urban TEA projects right now are actually located in the smaller scale cities, maybe in the cities that actually suffer for actual high unemployment.
Yes.
So we can see a lot of nice smaller cities on the right-hand side of the chart. And also for New York, before the RA, 27% of EB-5 investment went to New York, but right now it's only 5%. And also you can see the distribution of the EB-5 investment is more even right now. That means it's more evenly distributed and more like smaller scale, really high unemployment urban areas are enjoying the economic development driven by EB-5.
Absolutely. I think this is, again, one of the main criticisms is that EB-5 was going into areas that already had sufficient financial incentives and didn't need EB-5 on top of that. But as you said, based on the chart, on the post-RIA investment chart, you can really see it's much more equitably distributed among a lot of cities. It'll be interesting to see how areas that have never seen EB-5, whether it's urban or rural, will see EB-5 as part of the continued post-RIA EB-5 investment. So thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's a really important issue to point out. And Aaron, I would hope that, I know that as soon as the program the RIA got passed in 2022, you guys were all already started on reauthorization efforts. I have to believe that, given your history with Congress and everything else, that has been on your mind from day one. I think I would hope that the findings that Lee's been making throughout, but especially these really remarkable investment, patterns that we're seeing in rural areas, in other urban areas that have not historically seen EB-5, and kind of really that the successful deployment of the integrity measures and the transparency measures that have really been imposed on EB-5 stakeholders, that these are all working very well. It's all led to creating a better program. How does all this wonderful story, how does this factor into what you all have been already starting in terms of reauthorization efforts for 2027? Is there any concern of a program lapse again, or are we past that now that they've gotten the changes that they wanted in 2022? What are your thoughts as I know we're still 2 years off, but what are your thoughts as we look at down the road at reauthorization?
Well, first of all, a big thank you to you and to Lee, because the data that you guys were talking about is incredibly useful and impactful in our advocacy work. The economic impact study that Lee helped develop along with an outside firm has been an incredible tool for us in articulating the fact that EB-5 program is an economic development program. With regards to the reauthorization, you're absolutely right. We were talking about the possibility of a permanent authorization back in 2022. Obviously, that didn't happen. We got a long-term reauthorization instead, which was great. But now we're talking even more fervently about a permanent authorization. And I think that the message that we have is along the lines of the old campaign slogan, "Promises made, promises kept." The program was reauthorized in 2022 for the purposes of creating more integrity in the program and weeding out all the bad apples. We can check that box. That has happened, and it continues to happen. The other priority that members of Congress, especially Senator Grassley, had was that we direct more funding to rural areas. Well, you guys just articulated with the numbers. We can check that box. So the program is promises made, promises kept. Now it's time, Congress, to make this pilot program that's been around for 30 years a permanent program and to authorize it permanently going forward. Fortunately, there's actually precedent for it. The big, beautiful bill, the reconciliation bill that was recently passed, took advantage of political headwind or trade winds and made permanent the Opportunity Zone program.
Yes.
It's an economic impact program that overlaps EB-5 because opportunity zones quite often can or do, at least from a policy perspective, overlap TEAs. So there's precedent for the establishment of permanency for economic development programs like OZs, like EB-5. And so we're going to be leveraging that as well. And it's all part of a story that at least from my time in IUSA, we haven't had the opportunity to say with such clarity. Promises made, promises kept. It's time to make this program permanent and, in fact, to expand the number of visas. I mean, that's definitely one of our priorities as well, and we're leaning in on that, whether or not the political headwinds are telling us something else. So I'm very bullish about where we're headed and what's going to happen in 2027. I feel really good about it. I think that from a Republican perspective, this is definitely an America First program. From a Democrat perspective, I think there is an acknowledgement of the jobs that it creates across the country. Those are the messages that we've been taking to Capitol Hill. And to also help the reauthorization, back in 2023, IUSA created a political action committee. That's something that had never been brought to bear in the conversation around reauthorization as well. And so we're able to support members of Congress, candidates for Congress who support our priorities. And that sort of trade-off is very important in a town like Washington, D.C.
Yes.
And we have the only political action committee that's focused on the EB-5 sector. So with all of that going in our favor, I feel, as I said, very bullish about the opportunity to make this program permanent in 27.
Wonderfully said, very warmly welcome. I think, I will encourage everyone who's watching that we extend the efforts of IUSA to convene, to educate, and really share all the positives that EB-5 has done, especially since the RIA. If their goal was to bring EB-5 investment into areas that it hadn't seen, to bring more integrity and transparency in their program, like you said, all those boxes have been checked. And very happily to have done it. I think we all, for many reasons, enjoy that the program is more predictable. It is more transparent. It is something where benefits are being seen in areas that have not seen the positivity that EB-5 can bring about. So we hope we can continue that. I know, Lee, you and I have talked about even bigger plans to help support advocacy efforts. With the project in filing data we hope to get. We wanted to do an interactive map for IIUSA that shows this, not just for the congressional leaders that you guys are talking to, but for everyone to see the positive benefits of EB-5. So I think education is huge. And, I really cannot thank the two of you enough for all you've done for those efforts. speaking for myself, having been in EB-5 for over 20 years and having seen all its ups and downs, I can honestly say that the EB-5 program in the RIA era is better than ever. And for all of us to work as hard as we can to make that long-term and permanent is only good for this country. So thank you so much for your time today. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your information. And everyone who's watching, if you have questions about what else you can be doing to move this all forward, please reach out to IUSA, reach out to us. We're happy to share that information. It's a big charge forward, but I think as Aaron very prudently said, the best time is now. We are in a great position to really contrast what has happened in the past 3 years to what has happened in the past, and how it's just a better program. So thank you so much both for sharing.
Thank you for bringing us together.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you to everyone. I hope you enjoyed the discussion today. We're always open to more questions afterwards. And thank you for joining us.